This episode of Barracks of Hell explores the pivotal shifts in the concentration camp system in 1938. We start with the dramatic escape of Emil Bargetski and Peter Forster from Buchenwald, an act that set off a chain reaction of violence and a drastic increase in the deadly conditions within the camps. This incident reveals a turning point as the brutality toward prisoners intensified. We then examine the economic transformation of the SS, who, by the late 1930s, began to see camps as sources of economic gain rather than just detention centers. This shift in purpose is evident in two significant developments. First, we look at the SS move to extract natural resources from prisoners, especially in the new camps at Mauthausen and Flossenburg, which were strategically placed near quarries. Here, criminals and asocial prisoners were singled out for exceptionally harsh treatment, marking a dark new phase of prisoner exploitation. Second, we explore the Sachsenhausen brick factory, an ambitious project meant to serve Germany's reconstruction goals but with a deadly human cost. Welcome to Barracks of Hell, a podcast that uncovers the history of the concentration camps, from their origins to the dark chapters of World War II. I am Thijs, a history teacher from the Netherlands, guiding you through this brutal and complex history. It's Friday, May 13, 1938. A warm spring breeze drafts over the Eddersburg near Weimar, where the Buchenwald camp sits, casting long shadows. Prisoners are laboring outside the camp, backs bent and thirsty in the growing heat. Among them, Emil Bargetski and Peter Forster receive a task, a rare chance to fetch coffee for the work crew. But this simple errand doesn't go unguarded. SS guard Albert Kalweit is ordered to accompany them, ensuring the prisoners don't stray. Escape attempts were uncommon, the protocols loose and with little risk anticipated. Albert follows at a casual distance. He doesn't realize he's walking into their plan. Weeks of silent anticipation have led to this moment. As they move further from the group, Emil and Peter exchange glances. Albert has let his guard down, drifting a few steps ahead. In a flash, they seize their chance. A blow to Albert's head sends him collapsing to the ground. The silence around them thickens as they drag his body into the underbush, hiding it from view. Every second feels borrowed as they disappear into the forest. Back at the worksite, tension builds. Whispers of worry circulate. Where were they? And why had they been gone so long? An emergency signal blares through the air, and the SS guards begin scouring the area. Then, the grim discovery: a lifeless comrade among the bushes. Panic sweeps over the guards as the sirens wail. 2 prisoners have escaped. We will finish the story in a second, but first it's, I think, essential to explain why this event was so significant for the concentration camp system as a whole. It marked a turning point and it revealed that the change was already underway. We will begin by examining the shifts that were already taking place before this crucial breaking point, but let's first dive into who Emil Bargetski is and why that is so important. So Emil Bargetski has been detained as a criminal. He was identified with a green triangle. Every prisoner in the camp had a triangle that marked why he was there. Green stood for criminal activity. And in the early 1930s, we've heard in the first episode, the primary target of the camps were political prisoners. They normally were the red triangles. They were communists, social democrats, and there were also others that were opposing the regime in any way. By the late 1930s, though, this changed. Himmler, of course, as we explored in the last episode, he looked for reasons to expand the concentration camp system, and he saw threats not only from political prisoners, but he also saw them from the persons that were on the fringes of society. And Rudolf Diels, he's the former head of the Gestapo, he noted a shift in Himmler's view in the late 1930s.
First, it was the communists and social democrats. Then came the asocials, the habitual criminals, and anyone deemed undesirable by the Reich. No one was safe from Himmler's lists.
So Himmler was looking for new prisoners, and two groups were particularly singled out. The first, as I mentioned, were those with the green triangles, and they were labeled as criminals. This doesn't mean that we are talking about big mafia bosses or anything like that, but often minor offenders or individuals with small records, criminal records that were already very old, maybe before Hitler even took power. But they were all treated the same within the camp. And then there was also another group, and they wore the black triangles. And they were marked as the asocials. This is a category of anyone who fell outside of social norms. You could think of homeless people, unemployed people, anyone that falls within that category. It didn't really matter if their circumstances were by choice or not. So maybe something happened in someone's life that made him unemployed. He could still be targeted to be put into the camps. The purpose of imprisoning these individuals, so both the greens and the black triangles, was to re-educate them through forced labor. Now, we've mentioned that before. Himmler sees himself as a teacher, and his forced labor makes people better humans. That's what he thinks. And this was an idea that Himmler was very committed to. And camp guards soon realized that there was an influx of new prisoners, a new type of prisoners, and that it served a different aim than before. And one SS guard recounted,
"We learned quickly that these men with green or black triangles were not just there for politics. They were degenerates in the eyes of the Reich, to be treated as such."
Beside new groups that were targeted, so these green and black triangles, the camp system also expanded because of Germany's international activities in 1938. In March of 1938, Austria was annexed, and then later in the year, parts of Czechoslovakia were annexed. So more political dissidents were brought in, and they were detained as well. Because you have a new country, there's, of course, communists there as well, social democrats there as well, and they have not been targeted yet by the Germans, so they can be picked up now. So what happened to the camp population, it surged from around 8,000 prisoners in early 1938 to 24,000 in 1939. So you have new groups of prisoners that are being detained, but also new or old groups like the political prisoners that were detained from new countries. Former Buchenwald prisoner Fitz Leuner-Beda reflected on this drastic increase.
"We barely had space to lie down anymore. Each day, new faces arrived, the barracks filled to their limits. It was as if the world was collapsing in on us, and everyone unwanted was being shoved into the camp."
And of course, as the prisoner numbers grew, so did the number of camps. And that's a topic that we will discuss later in this episode. But let's return now to the escape that I talked about at the start of this episode. So, the day after the breakout, Himmler himself visited Buchenwald because he wanted to oversee the situation. Well, what he did was he offered a reward of 1,000 marks for any tip that led to the capture of either man. But for several weeks there was no trace of the escapees. They had no clue where they were. But on May 22, 1938, a lead came in about someone hiding in a brick factory around 200 kilometers north of Buchenwald, quite far away. So police started to investigate and they found Emil Bargetski there. And once he was captured, Bargetski faced a show trial that meant to ensure in a death sentence. And indeed, of course, you can guess it, he was sentenced to die. But he was actually, this is where the story becomes another significant change. He became the first prisoner to be officially executed within a concentration camp. So before this moment, lots of people died in the concentration camps, but these were always people that escaped or attacked a guard or whatever reason was given for their death. But now someone was officially executed. So on June 4, 1938, around 7 a.m., he was led through the gates of Buchenwald and hanged there. The execution was brutal. It was a slow, agonizing hanging that took minutes for him to die. And Peter Forster, the other one that escaped, faced the same fate. They parted ways when they escaped, and he went to Czechoslovakia, where he was safe at first. It was, of course, a different country. He couldn't be picked up by the police there. But, of course, as I just mentioned, Czechoslovakia, parts of Czechoslovakia were annexed by Germany in 1938, and he was extradited when that part where he was sitting was annexed. And also he was as well sentenced to death, and his hanging would also be in Buchenwald. So Emil and Peter were the only prisoners officially sentenced to death and hanged in a concentration camp before the war. So why were Emil and Peter executed within the camps rather than through the standard justice system for criminals? This is something that would have normally happened. This is because Himmler wanted to send a powerful message. Escape is punishable, and from here on out, escape would be punished with death as well. But attacking a guard, that would be crossing all lines. And his message resonated clearly throughout the camp. Eugene Kogan later reflected on the impact of these two hangings.
Emil was the first to be publicly hanged in Buchenwald for his escape attempt and for striking down an SS guard. The message was clear. Any step outside the line, any challenge to their rule, would be met with death. Bargatsky's death was meant to instill fear, to remind us all of the power they wielded.
Carlwhite's death marked a shift in the camp's overall brutality. The murderous violence within the camp system intensified dramatically after the escape and after the death of this SS guard. And the guards at Buchenwald, they launched a violent spree following the attacks. On Friday, May 13, 1938, Emil and Peter's work group, of course, had to be brought back to the camp. And they were done so by ruthless force. They were beaten, they were kicked, until they got back to the campsite. And once they were inside, they were severely beaten. And several of these guys collapsed in agony. They were hurt, and they were mistreated badly. The camp commandant, Otto Koch, informed prisoners that their lives would only grow harsher from that moment forward. And the attacks continued. So about 3 weeks later, SS guards stormed a barrack and they destroyed everything that was there, and also killing 3 prisoners. So there was way more violence following the escape attempt by Emil and Peter. And Johan Newman is a former Buchenwald inmate, and he reflected on this rise in violence.
The brutality after the escape was unimaginable. Guards took out their rage on anyone they could. Beatings became more frequent and punishments harsher, with little regard for life. We all felt the weight of that one act, knowing that any perceived disobedience could mean our lives. Bargatsky's escape seemed to open a new chapter in cruelty.
SS guard Carlwhite became something of a hero for the SS. He was a celebrated martyr by his colleagues and also by Himmler and Eicke, who used his death as a propaganda tool. And they basically said, so Himmler and Eicke said, that it showed the dangers that the SS guards were in and what they were doing for society and the benefit of society. So following this, Himmler issued a decree that permitted camp guards to shoot more readily when a prisoner tried to escape or displayed any form of resistance whatsoever. And former prisoner Paul Snyder describes the change after the decree.
Himmler's decree was clear. Any prisoner who attempted escape or displayed any aggression was to be shot without hesitation. This decree was an open license for the guards, creating a terror that spread through the camps. We knew that even a wrong look could now be grounds for death.
So this decree essentially granted SS guards a license to kill prisoners without facing any of the repercussions. Let's look at the shift in numbers, because we can see the shift in numbers definitely. In Buchenwald, before the escape attempt, there were 7 prisoners that died in March and April 1938. Only 7. Which is still too much, of course, but it's in comparison not a lot. In June and July of the same year, so a couple months later, this figure soared to 168 deaths. This is a staggering increase, more than 20 times the previous count. So you see that the death rate in Buchenwald, but also in other camps, dramatically increases. What we are witnessing here is that 1938 became the year when the camp system began to take on a distinctly murderous character. More groups were targeted for imprisonment. We talked about the green and the black triangles, but also, of course, the other countries that were next. So the pool of detainees expanded, but also the brutality of the guards grew sharply. And this would be a trend that would only intensify it in the coming war years. (1938) marked the year when the camps became significantly more deadly and violent. This shift was not only due to the things that we just discussed, but this was also due to a new economic perspective that the SS embraced. And we will dive into that one now. In the early camps, there were two primary types of work. The first one is external labor assignments. They were often conducted at specific sites to meet regional needs. And we can think of draining the moors at the Emsland camps in 1933-1934, or constructing infrastructure around the camps or in nearby towns or something like that. So this work was often grueling, and it seemed never-ending, as Wolfgang Langhoff describes.
The moors were endless and unforgiving. Every day we'd sink deeper into the mud as we worked with no end in sight. The guards pushed us relentlessly, knowing that the harder we worked, the weaker we became. We weren't just breaking our backs in that swamp, we were losing ourselves.
The second type of labor was building the camps themselves. Most of the early camps were set up on repurposed sites or constructed entirely from scratch, and prisoners shouldered much of the work that needed to be done to build them. So in the early years of the camp system, the construction became the main task for these detainees. And Eugene Kogan describes the toll this labor took on prisoners.
We built these walls ourselves brick by brick, while enduring beatings and the relentless screams of the guards. Every stone laid felt like adding weight to our own chains. The days were endless. From dawn until dusk, we labored under the watchful eyes of men who despised us. There was no relief, only exhaustion that deepened with each strike of the hammer and each shove of the shovel.
So the downside of assigning prisoners to external labor, as we have discussed in earlier episodes as well, is that it exposed them to public view. They had to pass through the gates of the camp, they had to move through towns, and they headed to different sites, allowing bystanders to witness their treatment. Which, of course, in the early years of the regime, fueled public criticism, and there were trials and all these things that we mentioned in earlier episodes. So despite this issue, of course, there was a positive thing for the regime as well. That was that it served as a terror tool to the population that saw what happened within these camps. So there's a good and a bad for this. But not all prisoners were put to work in the early camps. Sometimes there was nothing to do. There was not enough labor of the camp was already built. So it left many prisoners idle. And Margaret Buber-Newman recounts this experience.
The days were long and empty. We sat, waiting, often for nothing. There was no work to do, and the guards would grow irritated with us for just existing there without purpose. The lack of activity became its own form of torture. Days blurred together, and we were left alone with our thoughts, which was perhaps the most punishing labour of all.
In the early years, many camp leaders viewed their role as primarily safeguarding rather than economically productive. And this approach began to shift in the mid-1930s when the camp SS, redefined their perspective on prisoner labor. So Eicke in particular, he was not a big fan of prisoners being idle. And he emphasized continuous labor to keep them occupied and also disciplined in his eyes. And he said,
"The prisoner is not to experience idleness. Work is both a punishment and a method of re-education. Only through constant labor can we break the will of those who oppose the state."
So in earlier podcasts we mentioned the push for increased secrecy, and this led to fewer external work assignments, making the construction of new camps a priority task, which of course in 1936 and 1937 wasn't a problem with the building of Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. So Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and also later Mauthausen and Flossenburg, they all required intensive labor from these prisoners. And that meant that these prisoners were occupied, and these camps were built from scratch. The initial months of construction proved to be the deadliest period of a camp construction. We will see that later in the war years as well. I'll come back to that. But for example, in Buchenwald, 53 prisoners died in its first few months, while established camps like Sachsenhausen in the same months only reported 14 deaths. So we see that once a camp is being constructed, it is way more deadly. Historian and former prisoner Eugene Kogan explains why building new camps was so lethal.
We were forced to work from dawn till nightfall with barely any rest, under the watch of guards who drove us forward with sticks and whips. Many couldn't keep up and were simply left to die or beaten to death on the spot. The building of these camps demanded more lives than anything else.
All right, so we've seen two types of labor: the external labor for regional needs and also the construction of new camps. These were the primary types of labor in the first years, but there was already an experiment in 1933 with a third form of labor for prisoners. And this was SS-owned businesses that were run by camp inmates. So at Dachau, in 1933, workshops were established to produce furniture and other supplies for nearby SS facilities. Most of these camps, especially Dachau and Sachsenhausen, but also Buchenwald, had big SS facilities surrounding these camps. In Dachau, this setup turned out to be profitable. It allowed the SS to cut costs, and it kept prisoners occupied, which is something that Eike loved to see. So for the first time, inmates were seen as a potential source of revenue rather than just an expense. Of course, you have to still think that every prisoner that was held in a concentration camp cost the state money. So if it could also be a source of revenue, it would cut down the costs. And this leads to the rise of a man called Oswald Pohl, and he's a loyal party member of the Nazis since 1923, and he rose through the ranks during Hitler's rise. So up until 1933, he was already 10 years inside that party membership, and then after Hitler took power, he gained more momentum. Himmler was very impressed with Pohl's administrative and financial skills, and he gave him increasing responsibilities within the camp system.
Pohl is one of the most diligent and dependable men within our ranks. His ability to structure and organize the financial foundations of our Reich's mission has been unmatched.
By 1937, Oswald Pohl reached the same rank as Theodor Eike, and he gained comparable influence, although they were working on different fields within the camp system. Eike was mostly focused on the operational side of the camps, as we have already seen, but Pohl was dedicated to the SS economy and the economic ambitions of the SS. He viewed the camp system as a potential revenue stream. So, in these same years, architect Albert Speer was commissioned by the Reich to rebuild Germany, basically by Hitler. He wanted to rebuild Germany. And this effort would require billions of annual bricks for only Berlin alone. Not even talking about the other cities. So Himmler and Pohl, they saw an opportunity to incorporate the camp system into this monumental project. And to manage this, Pohl founded the German Earth and Stoneworks, or DEST. And Himmler placed high hopes in Pohl's plans to make this a success.
I am confident that Pohl's economic vision will not only fuel the resources needed for Germany's strength, but will also transform our camps into engines of productivity.
So in order to ensure meaningful contributions from the camps, they needed to be situated near raw materials that were needed for that rebuild of the Third Reich of Germany. And Eike and Pohl, despite their differences, they didn't always like each other, and they had many different views that they collided on. But they went out on a trip to scout camp locations that were close to quarries and eventually settled on two key sites, Flossenburg and Mauthausen. Now, these camps would soon supply the Reich with large quantities of stone. At least that was the idea. And alongside these sites, two brick factories were also established, and we will discuss that later in this episode as well. At least one of them, which one? The one is that is near Sachsenhausen concentration camp. But let's first take a look at the two new camps and how they took shape. The SS had big economic ambitions, and they needed the right locations to make them happen. Germany and Austria are full of quarries, And in March 1938, Eike and Paul, they set off on a tour and they scouted different sites for new camps. They visited many quarries and evaluated each one of them, and they finally chose 2 spots, and these weren't just any locations. They were carefully selected to support the SS vision of industry and expansion. So they choose sites where they could, for years, work, expand these camps, and hopefully gain some money from them. So they reported back to Himmler, and Himmler was very pleased with what they had found.
The SS has an interest in ensuring that Germany has access to sufficient stone for monumental building. The quarrying done by prisoners will serve the Reich and discipline those who are deemed enemies.
So one location that they chose was in Germany, close to the Czech border, and it was positioned between Buchenwald and Dachau, near a town called Flossenburg. And the other one was in newly annexed Austria. So Austria was annexed in 1938 in March. And this tour was done in 1938 in March as well. And it was near the town of Mauthausen. And these were the chosen sites where the SS aimed to bring their economic plans to life. And once the decisions were made, preparations moved very fast. So Flossenburg officially opened on May 3, 1938. That's 1.5 months after they chose the site. And Mauthausen followed a little later on August 8, 1938. At first, like in many other camps, they used existing working quarters, and this time at the quarries, to house the prisoners. But before long, the prisoners themselves were tasked with building the new camp facilities. And later, a former prisoner from Flossenburg, Joseph Haydn, would recount just how grueling this camp construction was.
We were the builders of our own prison. They made us dig, carry, build, with no rest, under threats and beatings. The camp took shape with our blood and sweat, and that's what held it together.
The setup process for a new camp was fascinating in its chilling efficiency, and Eike, of course, had this blueprint for establishing new camps, like he had done so with Dachau, but also with Sachsenhausen. So what happened is initially they looked for existing buildings to house prisoners in temporarily, while they were building these permanent barracks. And after that, while they were doing that, they also brought in seasoned SS guards from other camps to establish control and implement the regime's order. So from the minute the camp started, there was the same order in these camps as they were in Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald or other camps. For these new camps, the first groups of prisoners would be selected from the so-called criminal and asocial groups, the groups that I've mentioned before. These are the ones with the green and also the black triangles. And the appearance of these new camps, they stood out from the other camps, and this was due to their location near quarries. Mauthausen in particular was constructed to resemble some kind of a fortress. You can look up a picture and you will see what I mean. It was complete with granite walls and also a very imposing entry gate. And Francisco Bois, he's a Spanish prisoner who later testified, and he noted the camp's foreboding architecture.
That gate was like the mouth of hell. It was a fortress built of stone, meant to show us that there was no escape, no hope. Entering through that gate felt like crossing into a world from which few would ever return.
And also Simon Wiesenthal, he's a former Mauthausen prisoner, described the gate.
The gate of Mauthausen wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement. Its granite walls loomed over us, a reminder that this place was built to crush any trace of humanity.
Before the war, prisoner numbers at these new camps stayed relatively low, with around 1,000. This is quite small in comparison to the other larger camps that were already established. I think Mauthausen had around 1,400, and Flossenburg around 900 prisoners. But as the war progressed, these numbers would surge, and they would pick up with the other camps as well. There was a crucial change, though, in these new camps, and that was the type of prisoner that was sent to these locations. Himmler made a deliberate decision to send individuals that he considered society's most worthless, and they were sent to these camps. Criminals and so-called asocials were seen as the lowest rank within society, but also within the camps, and they were tasked with the hardest labor. But why were these camps then chosen for these prisoners labeled the worst enemies. So it had everything to do with the brutal nature of quarry work. The labor was exhausting, it was dangerous, and there was a higher chance of dying. So Himmler showed little concern for the lives that were lost in these harsh conditions.
The asocials and hardened criminals are to be put to work in the quarries. Their existence poses a threat to the community, and by sending them there, we ensure they will pay their debt to the Reich with hard labor.
And also, Oswald Pohl agreed with Himmler on this matter.
These men, criminals and degenerates, are precisely those who should be in places like Mauthausen, where their labor contributes to the greater Reich effort while removing their harmful presence from society.
The SS viewed these prisoners as society's most dangerous elements, and they believed that the fewer of them who survived the camp system, the better. So whether these individuals posed any real threat or had been unjustly assigned the green or black triangles, which happened quite a lot, mattered little to Himmler. The early months at both camps were brutally harsh, and as we've discussed before, constructing new camps was often very deadly, and in this case, quarry work only added to these hard conditions. Prisoners working in the mines faced extreme risks. So in Mauthausen, in particular, it was infamous because of the steep staircase that was there, where prisoners were forced to carry heavy stones up on their backs. And if someone stumbled or couldn't continue because they were tired or injured or whatever, they were met with severe beatings from the guards, and often, sometimes, they were fatal as well. So the Spanish prisoner that we heard before, Francisco Bois, he survived those stairs, and he later testified about the horrors that he experienced going up them.
We called it the stairs of death. Every day we carried stones on our backs, sometimes weighing as much as we did, up the steps. If you stumbled, you'd fall, and others would fall with you. And if you couldn't stand up, the SS would beat you, sometimes to death.
In its first year, Mauthausen's quarries claimed the lives of at least 131 prisoners. And this made it the deadliest camp by proportion, with nearly 1 in 10 prisoners perishing. Flossenburg, the other quarry camp that was established, was slightly less fatal. There were around 55 deaths in the same time frame, but the SS had now refined the process of establishing new camps, transforming them from simple holding sites into operations with economic objectives. And this was a big change. The location and the surrounding resources were now critical factors in camp planning. So before, they just looked at a location where they could expand easily, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. And now they were looking at, can we actually gain money from this venture? This also heightened lethality, and especially after the death of Albert Kalweit, where we started out with, and the ensuing crackdown in all the camps, it was felt across the whole system that the violence just skyrocketed after these escapees tried to get away from the camps. But camps like Mauthausen and Flossenburg, of course, because of the labor, were especially brutal. And despite smaller prisoner populations, their death rates were significantly higher. We've now observed one of the SS economic strategies at play, and in the coming years, these ideas would only expand within the camp system. We will see more examples of them creating a new camp for economic gain. By the late 1930s, the SS had already begun pursuing another initiative, and that was creating their own businesses and factories, and we will take a look at that now. It's a chilly dawn in 1938, just outside the barbed wire of Sachsenhausen. The ground is damp and the air hangs heavy with the scent of fresh clay and earth. Rows of prisoners stand silently in the morning fog, eyes hollow from exhaustion. They've been ordered here, to this muddy field where the SS is building a new facility, a sprawling brickworks factory. For weeks now, these men have been toiling day after day, underfed and overworked, heaving carts, stacking bricks and shaping heavy blocks of clay. The SS guards march back and forth, their shouts cutting through the air. Each prisoner knows the rules here. Keep working or suffer the consequences. The factory is part of a new plan, a brutal enterprise that treats human lives as mere cogs in the machinery of Nazi ambition. For the SS, this place is a business venture. For the prisoners, it's a relentless ordeal. Brick by brick, day after day, they are laying the foundation of something far larger than they know, one that serves the dark vision of the Nazi regime. The bricks they make here aren't just for ordinary buildings. They are destined for the grand Nazi structures of Germania, Hitler's vision for a world capital. But for now, their only view is the rising walls of the factory and the watchful eyes of the guards who make escape or even a moment's rest unthinkable. On July 6, 1938, the SS laid the first stone for an ambitious brick factory that was meant to produce an astounding 150 million bricks per year. This was set about 1.5 kilometers outside of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and the SS goal of 150 million bricks a year was staggering. It was 10 times the amount of what normal major factories in these days could produce in a year. And who would drive this massive operation forward? Of course the SS, but also the prisoners themselves. Every day, between 1,500 and 2,000 Sachsenhausen prisoners were pushed into hard labor to make this grand plan a reality. And Wolfgang Langhoff recalled the work.
We worked from dawn to dusk, lifting heavy loads in the freezing cold, with no proper clothing or shoes. The SS guards drove us relentlessly. Those who fell behind or collapsed were beaten mercilessly.
The work was brutal, the tools that were used were primitive, and the pace was relentless. So the SS had a point to prove, and they enforced it with violent force, pressing prisoners to keep up with a nearly impossible schedule. They wanted this factory to be done in a very, very short time, which was just not possible for the prisoners to do. And then also winter hit. There was a harsh winter in 1938, 1939 that tested the prisoners even further. They were not given any clothes that were suitable for freezing temperatures or rain or whatsoever. And of course the bitter cold claimed many lives. One of the survivors was Hermann Langbein, and he recounted the suffering.
The cold was beyond anything we had ever known. We had thin, worn-out uniforms, barely anything to shield us from the wind. Frostbite became common, and many couldn't move their fingers or feet after hours in the snow. We would work until we collapsed, and even then, the guards would kick us to our feet to carry on. Survival wasn't certain, but freezing was.
By the end, 429 prisoners had died just working on the factory's construction. But perhaps the worst part came in May 1939. The factory did its first test run, and it revealed that the bricks that it produced were useless, and a former prisoner describes the result.
The bricks crumbled to dust even as they left the kiln. They weren't stones, but brittle shells, useless and fragile. The SS had pushed for rapid production, but what they had was rubble, not bricks.
So the SS overreached. They lack both the know-how in brickmaking, and they choose the wrong location for the clay because the clay wasn't simply good enough to be converted to bricks. Now you might think after this failure they'd scrap the project and move on, but for Oswald Pohl, the SS head of economics, this failure was not an option, and Pohl wrote down,
"The SS could not afford to fail, and every setback was merely a challenge to prove our resolve."
His career was at stake, and he needed to show some results. So instead of stopping, he fired many managers and he brought in young replacements to keep pushing forward. And this time they tried a new process that managed to eventually yield around 3 million bricks per year by 1940, and that continued in the war years. And this is only 2% of their target. So what does this story reveal? The first point is that the SS was convinced that they could accomplish anything if they threw enough resources and prisoners at it. That was at least what they thought. A failing project didn't mean you should stop. It meant double down, put more prisoners in, harder work, and then succeed. So that brings us to the second point, and that is that they disregard human life, and they don't really care about high casualty rates. The quarries at Mauthausen also support that vision, and Sachsenhausen Brick Factory also supports it and proves the point. And the third point is that they lacked the expertise for these ventures. So Himmler and Pohl, they wanted everything handled within the SS themselves. So they refused to look for outside help and expertise, and that led to many repeated failing projects. The fourth point, and this is I think crucial to understanding the broader picture, this wasn't a one-off, and they would take on more projects like this in the coming years. They refused to learn from their mistakes, and their work harder mentality, mostly for the prisoners, led to even more dangerous conditions in the camps and more deaths resulting. In this podcast, in the coming episodes, we will see more deadly projects, all different kind of projects, but more deadly projects. So this was just the beginning. And then it's a clear indication that the camp system had become more deadly by 1938. Today we started with the gripping story of Emil Bargetski and Peter Forster's escape from the camp after the killing of SS guard Albert Kalweit. This incident marks a real turning point, and it set off a wave of violence in the camps just before the war, with victim numbers skyrocketing and guards becoming even more ruthless. Then we moved on to the SS' new economic ambitions. By the late 1930s, the SS shifted from being just a group of managing prisoners to a profit-driven enterprise using prisoner labor. This shift took shape in two main ways. The first one is that they started extracting raw materials, and they laid the groundwork for even more research exploitation down the line. This was when they set up the Mauthausen and Flossenburg camps near quarries, and they targeted groups like criminals and asocial prisoners for especially harsh treatment within these camps. Second, they began building a brick factory at Sachsenhausen that was meant to make money for the SS and support Germany's redevelopment. And we saw, of course, that this was a huge failure, but at least it shows what they were trying to do. In the next episode, we will dive into how targeted prisoner groups expanded even further as Jewish people became primary targets in late 1938. We will focus on the Kristallnacht and what came after, but we'll also take a look at Jewish life in Germany leading up to this violent event. So thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or you want to join the research, share your knowledge about this dark period, consider joining the Facebook group, and I'll see you in the next episode.